I'm not going to say too much. I think Klara will speak to her contribution. There's a conversation after this Q&A, etc. But it struck me as I was walking over here that the title, as I understand it now, is something. It's not something along. It's intergenerational transmission, necromancy, and future imaginaries, which in and of themselves are quite saturated. And we can probably talk a lot about how they might even connect. The thing that we had in one of the earlier versions of the title was it was prefaced by the labor of. The labor of intergenerational transmission, necromancy, and future imaginaries. And I want to put that back in the mix because what we're interested in really, and we've just identified as materialistically committed kind of people, are not so much the kind of broad speculative horizons of these practices, but really the instantiation of these as situated, sited, contingent operations and interventions. Right? So rather than speculating about different models of futurity or the kind of cyclical, ancestral, or whatever version of that is currently circulating in more or less interesting ways, I'm not dismissing the conversations, but it's not really what we were thinking about as we invited what we think is a really great series of speakers. We were interested in how these things play out in situated, sited encounters and interventions. And some of those resonate with things we might recognize as art-related in the art field. Some have slightly different areas of operation, but that's in a way what we're interested in. The specificities of these engagements, the kind of tools, the investments, the labor mechanisms deployed in order to open out a conversation and a set of practices around temporalities, generational sites, and moments and sites of historical culture and civilization belonging. So this was in a way the overall theme, but we're really interested in the labor dimension of that, the specificities of the engagement, the mechanics, if you want to call it that, or the materialities in a different lingo of these things. So really excited to have Klara Kofen here tonight with the most expensive cover slides we're not going to talk about. Fake, extinct, infrastructural hauntings. Klara, thank you so much for both prefacing this, inaugurating the series, and accepting our invitation, which was nebulous in part. So Klara's going to talk, and then Elle will we'll go into the conversational part and then open up for Q&A. You know the spiel better than I do, so Klara, thank you. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I wonder what I've got enough field in me. It's all good. I'm not sure about the amount of labor, as in that it's been discussed, there's labor in this, I'm not sure. We'll see. Thank you so much to Anna for inviting me, and I'm glad to be here. And also, thank you, Harris and Mr. Hale, for inviting me to run the research seminar in last autumn, and to all of the students who are part of this, because it kind of really helped me think through some of the structures I'm going to talk about today. I think like that seminar series felt like a really enthusiastic way of dealing with complete epistemic rupture. And to all the students who are here, I'm so sorry you'll have to hear some of the stuff again, but thank you all for having been there. Cool. So theoretically this should work. We just tested it out earlier, but obviously it didn't. Sorry. Okay, because I'm starting this series, I took the liberty of writing down my themed ins and outs for the year 2026, and we'll start with that. Then I'm going to set the station. We're going to briefly try and map out how I think about law, geography, and sovereignty and time, just very briefly. Then we're going to talk about infrastructure, because I called this talk Infrastructural Hauntings, and then had to retrofit everything I was thinking about to the term infrastructure. So I'll try my best to talk through it. Then I'm going to talk about three pieces, three works that I worked on. And we're going to talk briefly about how they conceptualize time differently. We're going to talk about dead type bounce and Apora, which conceptualize catastrophe and revolution of these moments of rupture. And then we're going to talk a bit longer about fate and extinct, the last piece I worked on, which is more about time and mulch. Then we're going to talk about chronocenosis in very detailed steps. And then hopefully we're going to get to digital twins at the end, and if time allows, there will be some real beautiful end to it. I just want to say that the linear structure belies the fact that we're going to be zooming in and out of scales quite a lot, and I'll probably also be jumping back and forth, but it's kind of in the the meetings. Okay, my ins and outs are, they come together. So in we're for temporal hybridity, and out is circular time as the go-to opposite of linear time. We don't do that anymore. Then I'd like to bring back ambiguity, not as a synonym for like everything that's morally dodgy or like not making decisions, but just the multiple questions and yes and states being together. Technology as not as opposite of nature or anything, but as an extended entity. And out is techno-mysticism, because while China they're building a hell of a lot of good shit with AI, Silicon Valley is still preoccupied with building what. I'd like to bring back detail and making time for it. Art is political positioning as the end goal. I'd like to kick out takes as attachments. I think it's become a bit too complicated for that level of attachment. I'd like to kick out legibility. I think things have become a bit too funky, but that's a great thing for art because we can work with that. You can read the others. I just want to say, like, continue from all of these previously working with your friends, kindness and generosity, and as the artist Costi was recently sharing his lots of the world. So I just wanted to start with that. Okay, so so this is partially, I tried to map how I think about these different interrelated spheres. And on the left you have this, what is known as the holy trinity of nationhood: jurisdiction, sovereignty, and territory. Sovereignty basically just means that you're entitled, that you make a claim on governing yourself, or the entity that you're part of, the territory, the jurisdiction that you're part of. But this tripartite is actually quite young. And I'm kind of interested in how, depending on geographic, cultural, and temporal context, these elements have been kind of, how they came together and how they've been constructed over time. And I'm very influenced by my favorite legal historian, Natasha Wheatley, who specializes in the history of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, one of the lesser known empires, or allegedly less exciting empires. But I was very taken by this book that she wrote called The Life and Death of States, in which she talks about how this empire that was multi-ethnic, multinational, multi-religious, multilingual, how in the 1860s they had to basically create a constitution for this empire. And unlike England that never had a constitution, unlike France that had a revolution and based its constitution off that, unlike the Germans, who went for like blood and soil and everything and then went wrong, they had to come up with like this strange kind of hybrid, monstrous thing. And the way that she talks about law is, and it makes it very exciting. And she says that she says in reference to Laura Bench, she says at the heart of imperial sovereignty are these odd and enduring links between landscapes and seascapes and territory and law. And I think there is a lot of, I guess like to me there's a lot of kind of almost like queer poetry in the way that these historians of law talk about legal history, because it becomes quite material. They speak about empires and coroners and sea lanes and islands and frontiers and the lumpiness of legal time. And when you look into legal history, you get to these points where like it's almost as if like geography, law, and metaphor ventriloquize one another, and that became quite an important aspect of making a scene, which I'll talk about later. And lastly, there is something peculiar about the temporality of law in and of itself. Because in order for law to be law, it has to be directed towards a kind of repeat application. And this continual readiness for application means that legal history has a different temporal rhythm and temporal structure from political history. And in legal terms, laws don't really die. Natasha Wheatley says they wear time. They're moth-eaten with periods of lapse, redoubled with cycles of renewal, scarred by resisting destruction, and that they have time texture, which I think is quite evocative. Now, in terms of infrastructure, I'm trying to like work time and infrastructure together, and I was trying my very hardest and calling upon Claude and ChatGPT and all the other gods to help me, but I couldn't find I found a text somewhere that described infrastructure not as the what, but as the when. That I cannot find anymore. So in view of that, I've got infrastructure down. I've been trying to think, I think about it as, on the one side, hard infrastructure and how it is constructed. Water systems, roads, telecommunications, power grids, and so on and so forth. And these are all forms of infrastructure that a sovereign state has to build. It's kind of like they're materializations of a sovereign's desire for longevity. Because in order to build it down, it takes generations to build, and it will last for much longer. So these like hard assets are quite interesting kind of material points where sovereignty and legality materialize. And then on the other hand, I always come back to Romola. I call her Romola. I can't deal with the fact that she's apparently called Lauren Berlin. But she, in her amazing book on the inconvenience of other people, takes the idea of infrastructure a bit further, and she describes it as the consistency-making, resource-distributing processes that are mediations that bind worlds together along with ideas about what the world might be. So that already has this kind of forward and backward motion of infrastructure and infrastructuring built into it. And then she references these two writers, Sharon Lee and Melina Yacoulou, potentially French, who talk about patina spaces as these slowly emerging objects being made from a specific usage that come to constitute historical, political, and potential environments. Patina spaces provide infrastructure through the practical touch that resonates to history and the sense of what is collective and accruing. And again, the collective, the kind of accruing element has this kind of sense of palimpsesting and like stacking of relationalities. And this sense of infrastructure or infrastructuring has helped me for the first time back like 2 years ago to connect my interest in history with my practice as, I guess, an opera maker. I've been running an opera company called Waste Paper Opera for, I think, over 10 years now. This is not Waste Paper Opera. This is the expensive opera where the slides come from. It was a terrible opera, but the slides were very nice. And because I work very closely with musicians, and so time is kind of both a material that a performance has to work with, but it's also the time of logistics it takes to create something multimodal and strange and so large and maximalist, and then how affect is created across these different modalities. I'm still using the word opera as a kind of container because I refuse to let the Royal Opera House get away with holding on to that term. Maybe we can talk about it later. But yeah, so multimodality, there is the Webster's definition of multimodal is multimodal goods may be damaged in, goods may be damaged in multimodal supply chains. And I always think that there is a sense of, like, when I think of opera, it's a logistical, infrastructural process that takes a lot of time. And for anything from the tears of an opera singer to their relaxation to the materiality of an item of set, or the light, or the kind of funding structures, everything kind of comes together in this hybrid monster. So yeah, and within that, there is a question of, like, if you're working with these different modalities, as you're scoring it, or as you're working, or as you're scoring it collectively, there is a question of what synchronizes and what doesn't synchronize, or what leads. And this is a, I thought I should bring this along. This is a multimodal score that I made for Admiral or Revolutionary Sentiments. I'll talk more about it in a bit. And this was because we were working remotely, this was like a very neat way of collectively organizing how things hit, and this could then be moved around. So this is, it doesn't look very sexy, the background is better. But yeah, this is kind of what I mean in the terms of scoring, but obviously between theory and practice, between diagram and stage, there is still a long way. And so, yeah, so I'm going to talk, like, I hate to do this, but this deadpan dance could really deserve its own lecture, But Dead Cat Bounds, or an oratorio of violence and catastrophe, was a piece that I made with Waste Paper Opera and Gary Zhang. And it started off just after the pandemic, and Gary and I have been in a reading group on in Lorraine Daston's The Origin of Classical Probability in the 17th Century, and we were very much in like statistics lab, and so this book, the catastrophe time book, and this oratorio kind of came together as a way of bringing together some narratives that had come out of this research, and it was first performed as a sound installation at Nina Matadero, and then became, and unfortunately, a touring oratorio, which was stupid because it was too big to tour, and then it became an exhibition. Dead Cat Bounds we chose the form of oratorio because in the 17th century, this form was developed during the Little Ice Age and what is known as the general crisis of the 17th century, as a way for primarily monks and nuns to discuss what happened, where things went wrong, so we took this old form and put new stories into it, and went from earthquake gods in Japan in the 19th century to Miami real estate that's already underwater in 2030, to crime profits, to insurance mechanisms from French Revolution, and we kind of brought all of this together around the idea of rupture and what happens at these moments of temporal rupture, and how reality is reorganized during these moments. And then Admira, or Revolutionary Sentiment, this was a piece that I created in collaboration with the artist Bahan Rizadeh, with Suruna Babao and Cameron Graham, who's here. Then got to tour it a little bit, and also learned how to perform in it, or like perform for the first time one of my pieces, which changed the whole idea of presence and temporality quite drastically. And Admira takes its name from a Baroque gesture, which looks like this, Baroque theatrical gesture, that is supposed to express awe or admiration, or the appreciation of the sublime, or love. And we use this gesture as a kind of opening to think about various revolutions and how these revolutions are repeated in gesture and affect time and time and time again. And the idea of, I guess, the kind of the central underbelly of revolutions. And this idea of eternal return. Admira would also deserve more time, but I think and then, I'm not really sure what happened in my head. I think October 7th kind of ruptured any sense of the idea of rupture, or it ruptured things too much, and it became, I guess it changed my thinking about time quite significantly. And Fake and Extinct came out of that. It was a longer process that went hand in hand with a lot of research on water infrastructures, both salt water and seawater, and and time came out as more of a competitive, conflictual, unstable form, and with that also came a new form of multimodal dramaturgy. I used different tools, found a way together with Cameron Graham to puppeteer little 3D faces, so the whole idea of puppeteering and agency kind of came into this dramaturgy as another, I guess, line on the score. It became, I'm not really sure at what point that happened, but my friend Gigi, or Hot Bodies from France, at some point called it a chambre d'apparition, or a ghost story, because all of these different sites that I researched kind of kept coming back, and it was eventually set around a table to deal with these different sites. And dramatically, I kind of tried to find multiple different ways of thinking of creating hauntings or memories, obligations or resentments or yearnings, and the kind of difficulty of expressing them and administering them. I'm going to take you through the sites now. This is probably going to be too fast, but you'll just have to bear with me. It felt like that when I was making it too. So this actually vending machine actually started off with that cat bounce because I was thinking about something. I was thinking about an entity that could score an oratorio that wasn't the conductor, and it wasn't the text, and it wasn't the performer. And I thought, like, well, if we had a vending machine that would empty itself over the duration of the performance, that would be great. But they're very expensive. I never managed to get one. But so I made one. I made one from fabric and set it on fire. That was kind of the closest I got to it. But vending machines are kind of became this kind of strange nexus because the first one was made around 70 AD by a guy called Hero of Alexandria to dispense holy water to pilgrims at thoroughfares. And then if you look them up now, they're kind of in these, like, you can get these fat manuals, they're like $2,000, where businesses can, like, that show businesses like where it's best to put them, because you can only ever put them in spaces where people have needs but are not rich enough to get good food. So that's the kind of modes where you put vending machines. But that also makes them the most cost and labor efficient mode of making money if you're an immigrant in your country. And then I learned that Coca-Cola has recently equipped, like they use in Bolivia, they equipped them with like a price gauging mechanism, so the hotter it gets, the more expensive the water gets, just to check how much they can sell Coca-Cola for in poor areas. And then last year, oh my God, it's last year, Claude ran a project, they ran a project on Claude where they were trying to test AI's ability to manage and acquire economic resources by making a little tiny digital vending machine. So this kind of thing kept ghosting around, and then I did a lot of work on what is known as marriages. The term is from, my goodness, I can't remember her name, it's terrible. French anthropologist was working on the Klara people, an indigenous tribe on the south coast of Chile, who've kind of created a new form of sovereignty on their, where they live, to prevent the area from overfishing and other forms of aqua economics, aqua industry. And so I kind of kept, so I started looking at all of the islands that had been used as watering holes during the colonial era, and it kind of produced a weird alternate history of empire, because when you go by these narratives, I did not know that plantation labor was first tried out on these tiny islands starting in cheaper. I did not know that New York became New York because of the nutmeg trade. And it kind of like opened up a different space of writing sovereignty. Then my friend Gary was working on a piece on the new data centers in Mian in China, and the fact that they build these data centers look like Swiss castles, and that was quite poetic, and that also goes around. And then I tried to find ways of kind of historically to basically learn about like the points at which water infrastructures had significantly shifted sovereign relations, or had made, like, where non-human entities had or infrastructures had changed the outcome in the course of history, essentially. And I did this. I should not show this for the story because it's a bit dodgy, but I fed Claude with a lot of stuff that I wanted to learn about, and it produced this archive of water, this water archive essentially, and that became the basis for the script for the digital puppet play. So all of these, and then the whole thing was set at a hydroelectric power plant in Dolomites, and hydroelectricity in the Dolomites is interesting because this very early on the image actually. But this is a tiny LiDAR scan of the place where I developed this work. It's called Centrale-Fis in Italy. And it's a hydroelectric power plant that they built to look like a neo-Gothic English castle. And there are two potential reasons for that. One is that it was just the ultimate expression of sovereignty, and this was a fault line between the contested Italian territory and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then the other idea was that I was told is that it was supposed to hide infrastructural assets in a potential war that would come less than 10 years after this was filled. So it's this. So like this kind of this infrastructure in the Dolomites is kind of quite interesting and very beautiful because all of the different plants look quite special. But it's now at this interesting point where so the European power grid is connected to these hydro plants, and water is funneled out of alpine lakes and then funneled into the European power grid. But the more water is funneled to Europe, the less water there is for the environment in that area, making landslides a lot more likely. And the whole area is named after, it's called the Marathons, which is the landslide, which happened about 1,000 years ago, where an entire bit of Alp just came down, and people are worried about this. And so Maloney is quite interesting. So like the concessions that are given out for hydro plants usually take about 100 years. And for these hydro infrastructures, these were made just after the First World War, and they're now running out. And Maloney is trying to bypass EU mandate and basically keep these power plants in Italian hands and not give them out to legal tender. And it's become this kind of quite strange space where like the right-wing Italian government is quite keen on the green infrastructure in the area because it's an anti-European thing that's also in many other ways arguing against green energy because it is right-wing, because you can't get votes through it. So and then a bunch of and I was when I was there, the amazing anthropologist Elizabeth Povinelli was also there, and she was giving a talk and also mentioned hydropower, and she said that there are some liberals in the area who said, like, well, like maybe we should just shift our focus away from water infrastructure and towards solar panels, which are then made in the Congo. And so like this whole place becomes this kind of strange palimpsesting of like old nationalisms and new nationalisms and like liberal aspirations towards the natural wilderness and the neo-colonialisms, and I don't know, it's quite a fruitful, strange ground. So I hope that you understood all of this and took all of this in, because we're now going to talk about chronocenosis, which is the which is the kind of theoretical scaffolding that helped me maneuver my way through it. Unfortunately, I just want to say I don't have a film version of making this, otherwise I will show it to you. I'll just do it here at some point. So, chronocenosis, I always say that it comes from my favorite historian, Natasha Wheatley, but it's actually a collaborative effort between Natasha Wheatley, Dan Edelstein, and Stefanos Geroulanos, 3 historians who wrote this book called Power and Time. And I wanted to show you basically the history of this concept, because it's quite interesting. There are 2 points. One of them is this UNESCO temporal project, an attempt to, as they describe it, an attempt to map the wild profusion of existing things. And then the other is Reinhard Koselleck, the kind of big German idealist daddy of intellectual history. We'll get to him after. But I always think that this is a really beautiful bit of time archive to look towards. Roughly around the same time, the League of Nations was thinking about how to synchronize trade time and cultural time as much as possible. And meanwhile, the UNESCO, this is kind of quite weird project where they got mathematicians and scientists and philosophers and artists and art historians from genuinely all over the world, and asked them all to contribute to a taxonomy of time. And this is from the original UNESCO files, but I just want to read you some of the kind of temporal acknowledge some of the terms in the taxonomy of time that they came up with. I will read all of them. So they have the empirical perception of time, time viewed as a series of points or a sphere, the philosophical elaboration of time and temporality, the consciousness of recurring time and of irreversible time, the pathology of time, the relativity of space-time, asymmetry of time in brackets and expanding universe and cosmological time, time and matter time, eternity as an individuation, interior time, the temporal view of history and the disalienation of man, in brackets Marxism, the eschatological view of history and history of salvation, and then the opposite, tragic optimism. And there is, in the way that the three historians who worked Power and Time describe it, it was a genuine kind of attempt to dislodge the Eurocentricism of temporal thinking. And they tried to find a kind of strange non-hierarchical universalism for like a new age, which this was in the 1970s before the new was coming. But then that project was abandoned, and I don't know if anything ever happened with it. So meanwhile, and of course, like, I really wanted to I tried to get ChatGPT to animate his face like we used to do with the old AI models, but it wasn't working. Yeah, he's like a closet idealist, and but his works have been incredibly influential. So Goldsmiths states, and he was also writing in the 70s, that at each historical age exists a multiplicity of concurrent temporal and historical planes. And he describes this as a stratification or stacking of temporal regimes, which organize experience differently but generate a stranglehold of alternative kinds of temporal change. And he's quite famous for this term Nachtzeit or simultime, which is when traditional concepts lose meaning and modern ones are yet to be established, which is I guess the same as the Gramsci, the oldest and the new kind of has not been born, time of monsters kind of stuff. Because of his influence, I think he kind of snuck in a kind of a way of synchronizing all other temporal modes around the European idea of modernity under the guise of doing intellectual history. But I still think it's sometimes it's long been my favorite way of defining modernity. And he writes, modernity relocating the past and future, producing a world accelerating towards an unknown and a noble future within which awaited the possibility of achieving utopian fulfillment. So the authors, Wheatley, Edelstein, is an amazing historian of the French Revolution, and Stefanos Geronanos, then kind of came together and thought about like how to come up with a concept that redefines temporal thinking. They say historians think that time is kind of their thing, but they don't often think about it. And that's when the idea of chronocenosis came up. And interestingly, they take it from Stephen Jay Gould, a biologist, who came up with the term biocenosis. And the key idea here is that evolutionary time is linear, that within organisms there is a multiplicity of smaller organisms, and from the small to the large, there are warrior constants fighting for hegemony within any other organism, and they interact in tension to build distinctions and likenesses of each creature. They interweave and hold one another. They do not blend, but dwell together in tension and fruitful interaction. And the authors took this to then start to define chronocenosis as the complex and volatile intersection of competing temporal regimes that allow for particular ones among them to appear dominant at given points in time. And importantly, multiple temporal orders are not mutually reducible, but working in dispersed ways and directions. And then it relates back to, so we're jumping around, back to the top. They're posing this against the instinct of harmonizing different temporalities into a seemingly sinuous, often undifferentiated temporal experience that largely eschews conflict. And that is all. And we have okay. Power and temporal regimes. I think I was kind of quite wary of talking about power and art school because I understand that you've all read Deleuze and Foucault, and I actually kind of haven't. But so I will just read you these couple of quotes from the book. So power, to describe how they define it. Power always calls into being its own temporal explanations and calculations, its own fictions, prophecies, and preferred histories. So you there have a stacking of the fictional and the so-called non-fictional. Power operates by arranging, managing, and scaling and synchronizing, this is going to come back later, temporal regimes and conflicts. These fault lines function as seams of structural weakness and possibility. Power is often undone and cut and thrust of temporal antagonisms. Every sovereign pursues continuity, often even eternity, and negotiates relationships with other established forms of time, religious, labor, economic, natural, legal, political, and essential, because I think it's nice. These politically significant domains complicate the temporal biotope in biocenosis. Temporality defines the emergence and effectiveness of political concepts such as genocide, totalitarianism, or fascism. I hope this helps to understand it. This is, I guess, that I wanted to add this slide, partially to bring Elizabeth Wheatley, partially to advocate more strongly for a view of time not as being made simply from ruptures, but from multiple different temporal regimes interacting with one another. And I've called this being a materialist of billion in a multipolar world. I'm talking about myself, but yeah, I think I could have unpacked this more, but that's what I mean. But I think, like, to come back to modernity, I think I have this lasting image in my head of this mountain ridge, this temporal mountain ridge, where you have like, like an undefined variety of like mystics and men and I don't know, like improvised music on one side, and then you've got like technology and fridges and everything on the other side. And the only thing that differentiates them really in this temporal thinking is the fact that there is a prior and there is an after. And sorry. I was very excited to hear Elizabeth Wheatley talk about the governance of the prior, which she talks about, both her and Natasha Wheatley talk about something very similar there in the context of Australia, and I was just talking to Elle about this, because it's a good use case, it's a good case where, for chronocenosis, and I regret not having put this in as an example, but in the 80s, a legal theorist, a lawyer called something Brannan, was involved in a case on indigenous land rights, and he said somewhere there that the indigenous land rights had been washed away by the tides of history. And after that had been said, this produced quite a strange legal setup for those types of indigenous land rights, because they had to both prove that they were there prior to European settlers, and that they were still there, and that there was a genocide, but that they were still there. And this creates this kind of strange temporality of both and, were prior but are still here. And Elizabeth Wheatley says that once sovereign power grounds itself in what is held must hold until it gives way. The indigenous emerged as the name for a prior being devoid of any specified content. Yeah, and I guess like this is a kind of like a temporal regime that primarily makes any kind of legal case for land rights continuously very hard. And this temporal logic, the cultural territorial concept defines who counts as indigenous. Disparate groups lay claim to priorness. Tribewise and reactionaries I enter. Zapatistas and environmental defenders, Italian regionalists and modern soil nationalists, as in the hydrocarbon setup, gender, culture, not place of politics, only temporal priority claims. And then call upon Timothy Mitchell, who says historical time, the time of the West, is what gives modern geography its order centered upon Europe. And given that Europe is no longer at the center, I mean, it's trying very hard not to be at the center of anything, I feel like that we need a slightly more sophisticated, detailed toolkit to think about temporality moving forward. I think I'm going to continue because I think it would be nice to have a little bit more time for this bit. This is what I'm currently working on, and I think of it as a bit of it's a paradigm shift and a bit of a game changer in terms of thinking about archives and thinking about temporal regimes. And this is to, I'm not sure if you've come across the concept of a digital twin, but it's essentially it lives within the same sphere as simulation models, and it's fundamentally a virtual replica of a complex system. This could be a human heart or a factory floor, or in the case of NVIDIA's Earth, to the whole world, or a water system. And it's fed real-time data to then be called upon by policymakers and people working in factories to decide which direction to take, which action to take. And once it's been asked this question, it then works through multimodal data, so sonic data, images, sensor data, patient histories, videos, recordings, and through a process called attention weighting, it decides which data stream is matters the most, and then synchronizes all of the other ones to that. There are a bunch of problems just in terms of computational ability that are already quite obvious in that because AI, like a lot of simply aren't very good at time coding. But I think the interesting thing is that this whole process of deciding which modality or which data stream matters the most is entirely black boxed. And not only that, but also once it's been asked what course of action should be taken, it basically runs through a bunch of counterfactual scenarios and then spits out one answer. But no one from neither engineers nor policymakers can check what the alternatives were. For this, basically led me to conclude that this is a form of computational chronocenosis. And I think it's both fascinating and scary and delightfully sexy in that way, but because these large machines completely redefine how we think about synchronicity and time. We've been thinking about history and historians, and what all of these wonderful historians do is that they go to archives and then they write and rewrite history, and whenever there is new information, the history is rewritten again. But if these models become assurance mechanisms for policymakers that are needed in order to take a particular course of action, the whole idea of which voice matters, or what voices can we bring to the table, just completely disappears as a possibility. The image that you see is a badly animated version of NVIDIA's Earth-2. The plan is to have a digital twin of the entire world. The other interesting or weird one was a digital twin of the 14th century church. No idea where they get that data from, what they want to check. And then the last one, which is weird and kind of worrying, is a digital twin called Riley. And it's a digital twin that has been fed with patient histories from LGBTQ plus teenagers with suicidal ideation in the US. And the idea is that you can use it to train healthcare professionals to see what happens. So I take this from Louisa Moore's beautiful essay, because the twin is not a copy, that the digital twin itself changes the very meaning of what depression or anxiety or suicide is. So there's also this strange semantic shift that is about to come. I'm going to end the content here. I've left enough time to play the longer bit if we want to play the longer bit. So I'm just, so you can settle, I'm just going to leave you with some opera. This is from Beckett Bowles, and this is a piece of music originally by Niccolo Gemeni from 1758, and it forms part of the tradition of city laments, which is when the prophet says, like, I told you the city would burn, and the city burns, and it says, I'm crying because the city has burned. So this is the narrative, and then it's Gary and me talking over it. Enjoy. Which involves everyone.
I'm truly grateful for the opportunity to spend time with you today to explain clearly We are all in this together.
On a day-to-day basis.
And so are the other organisations in our sector.
We live in a world in which all of us are engaged.
This reminds me of something you said earlier, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Appreciate the opportunity to set the record straight and explain why we ultimately could not have prevented what has now happened.
I'm here to be as helpful as I possibly can, and then I want to take your questions.
Then I want to take your questions. Lumber seems to be the poster child.
It always begins somewhere, but we have to look at the entire supply chain now. In any case...
Sorry, Mark.
No, please.
No, please.
Please, I'm here to be helpful.
The first question is, can you just get it from looking at it once, or do you have to go granular?
Exactly, Mark. That's a great question.
Thank you, Mark.
We're all in this together, and we must all take responsibility. Like they say,
sometimes it's brightest before dusk.
That's right, Mark.
I want to be as helpful as possible. Just get opposite the water.
We all have responsibility on a day-to-day basis. So many tributaries, so many people at our hearts.
We live in a world in which all of us are engaged.
None of us act alone.
With the benefit of hindsight, mistakes were made.
Would we have done it? Yes. But the Goldsmiths Assembly's reports have had significant consequences, and I'm delighted to be here with you to set the record straight.
It is unfortunate that some of the records that have come out have had significant consequences.
Thank you very much, Mark. I really appreciate this opportunity. I want to be as helpful as possible.
Like you.
I'm just going to take a sip of water.
Like you, I feel horrible. No one has more incentive to see us succeed than I do.
I'm just as angry as you are.
Thank you, Mark.
That's a great question.
Over the last few years, we've proven ourselves to be one of the most dependable and sustainable providers of a wide range of services, including due diligence,
Downside restructuring.
needs,
Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Klara.
Thank you so much.
I think I am going to have to bring the microphone over here. Yeah. Wow. That was tremendous. Thank you very much. And I don't know where to begin, actually. So unbelievably, wonderfully informative and inventive. And yeah, I think I'm going to ask a practical question in a minute, maybe from my own grounding, just to ground me. And I've been working with a Sami artist who's been translating from Norwegian and Sami into English the Norwegian Truth and Reconciliation report that is currently circulating. And I was just thinking about how we've been working together and the tools we've been using around voice and sound and reading to offer moments of translation and to capture moments of translation in these different ways. And I wondered what the place of translation was in your own practice through this tool of opera. and voicing,
Okay.
and the dialogical.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's I think translation is kind of key. Like at some point I thought like opera is by far the dumbest form to use if you're interested in this kind of stuff, because it's quite abstract, and in opera at some point, something is translated into an action or a word or something. But I found that, for example, I worked with Opera worked with a microbiologist back in 2017, and we were working on parasitism. And something really weird happened when we started to translate parasitic evolutionary cycles into opera, because it just became pretty fascist. Because there's something about putting a body on stage and putting a voice to something, and it in the way that it kind of brings out the stakes of an otherwise abstract thought. And I'm not saying that this is let's personify all of the I'm the legal document kind of panto stuff. But there, I think in the process of translating it into the materialities of a performance, something strange, the content transforms. And I think, and then the other thing is that, everyone has different ways of working with performers, but in most cases, no opera singer opera singers might not be that interested in your interest in legal history. So how do you translate the detachment of a legal historian from the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1865 to an opera singer who's there's a strange mode of thinking about these things in different registers, and that's not dumbing it down. It's just, I think of it as elevating it, because you start realizing things that don't happen if you just talk about it. In terms of the dialogical, I think I'm eternally frustrated at how bad I am at writing essays, and how much easier I find it to write dialogues. I think I think the dialogical has come out as a kind of shifty way to get to say what I want to say without having to write an essay. Right. Cop out. It's a cop out.
Okay. I'll just ask. I'll ask one more question before I open up. I wanted to this framework, I guess, of chronocenosis.
Yeah.
And I was really intrigued by this in relation to time and the temporal and the different time spaces. Again, in relation to this other research I'm doing with Svea, and how it becomes this concept and framework, and then how it manages to not be just a retrospective framework or form, how it can be in the contemporary. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that.
Interestingly, so the book Power and Time is kind of great, but at the end of the introduction, where the authors introduce chronocenosis, they say this is us three historians, but there are archaeologists who are working with this. There are legal theorists who are working with this. So it's a question. So they're opening it up to how can this work in other contexts, and they end up on 2 points. One of them is that chronocenosis becomes particularly interesting in the realm of technology, but because of the people that it's a French Revolution theorist in 19th century Austro-Hungarian. I'm not sure what Stefanos Coriolanus does, but it's not their métier, which is why I have been thinking about how to use this concept which is why I think the digital twins are so interesting. Whether there is a more useful concept to use there, I'm not sure, but it appeals. And then the other thing is that they actually end up on a really nice call on an aesthetics of chronocenosis, and saying the documents that we have to describe this, they're not made for this. So they call it an aesthetics as well, and it's kind of low key a call for art to be made in that kind of vein. That's what I got.
Okay. I'm going to have to open it up, because I'm going to ask just practical questions, but I'm sure there's other questions that people would like to ask Klara. So if anybody,
Unless there's somebody else.
No, shall I pass this over?
Yeah, sure. I'm not going to echo the things, but just there's a couple of things that really struck me as nuggets to become here. So one was an original piece in passing about the ways in which law, landscape, and metaphors start ventriloquizing each other. Right? And I was really interested in what that affords, what that allows you to do both in the performance, in the research, etc., in the talk presentation. And from that, a couple of things coalesced around that. One is the idea of the lumpiness of legal time, and then your invocation of the, is there a weight for that too?
Yeah.
And so the lumpiness of legal time, which describes a material property to time that we are not used to recognizing, let's put it that way. And from that, hope it's not too jumpy, I end up with your chart diagram thing around multimodal dramaturgy, right? And that's what struck me is stacking off time. You have all kinds of material accounts of temporality that we're not used to, whatever, that the Western, that post-Enlightenment framework doesn't allow for. Once you take that to dramaturgy, through this idea of a broad set of infrastructural properties, right? So like dramaturgy is concerned with bodies and stages and architectures and legal frameworks and commissioning backgrounds, including time. The question that leads me to is like, how do you get to the point where time does not just have material properties, but it becomes a material for redistribution? Right? So what I mean is a material that is open to and available to the kind of redistributions that dramaturgy or the kind of organizational forms that dramaturgy, for instance, is concerned with, which are then in a way at your discretion. And what are the limits of that? Because I know I think you're very clear in not wanting to generalize temporality as some kind of available law. But I'm interested in this, what kind of material, how does it become, how does time in that both restricted and expenses become material for the redistribution in practice? Sorry, long-winded, but hopefully there's an answer.
Okay, so I think there is, if it's okay that I would answer the question. So the first question was more on the ventriloquizing of law and geography. And I'd like to respond to that with I get like a historical oddity that I always keep coming back to, but that's a theoretical thing. And then on the other, to the other part of your question on how to redistribute time, I have a plan for that stuff. I know. Just so thank you for the question. So there's an amazing essay by Deepesh Chakrabarti on how in the 17th century, because nature was so fucked up and because there were so many revolts and so many wars. So that was the period when the discipline of history was being born. But the people who were responsible for birthing it, basically, it's like a latent scholasticism was in the discipline. So they said that there is history, which is politics and law and economics and everything, and then there is the environment, but God is responsible for that stuff. And so it's taken a hell of, which is also why I was so excited about these historians taking a model from Stephen Jay Gould to think about temporality, because it's taken a hell of a long time for history to not just say now not only can we use documents, but we can also use pottery, but for them to say maybe the way that a river moves has an impact on how we think about sovereignty. And I guess but then there is a question of agency, right? Then there's, because we don't want to. Is this? Yeah. Sorry. There. Yeah. So I think that's an interesting space. I was thinking there is a slippery slope there into the vibrant matter world, which I don't have a problem with. But once we start thinking about mushrooms and rivers to have the same agency as humans, it gets theoretically quite mushy, and we can. And I guess that's why I always come back to law, because no mushroom has ever imprisoned large amounts of immigrants. So we don't all have the same agency. Sorry, this is a very long-winded answer around the ventriloquy. On the second part, so I have this method called the immovable dramaturgical object. I've yet to put it to the test when it comes to making a full show, but the idea, so within let's say an opera, but I think theatre and I'm sure choreography as well has similar concerns.
So we know that building a set or making a costume takes a different time, works differently there. You have to have a good idea, and then you spend all of the money, and then you make it, and it has to be good. Whereas, improvisation, devising, that takes, you start off with nothing, and then you build and you build and you build and you build. So how the hell can you bring those two together? I run this workshop sometimes called the immovable dramaturgical object, and the idea is that a group of people has to work with all of the modalities that we have at hand, light, text, sound, and everything. And then in the next round, they have to do the same thing, but only with 3 modalities. It usually produces quite nice stuff, but one of the affordances is that at some point everyone becomes, I become aware of what every modality does and what happens if you don't have it, or if you don't give it enough time, or if you disregard it. That just sounds more like a pedagogical method, but I think you could theoretically scale it up and see what happens. I mean, maybe the show would be shit. Ultimately, we just want to make good art, and I put art over pedagogy. So sorry, but I guess that's how I do it. That's how I think through it. Well, thank you for the question.
Wasn't the question also about the toolkit of temporality and what that might look like?
Yeah, maybe.
I just wanted to go back to that. That's a
yeah, but I
possibility.
need to have a sip of water, so I think someone else should ask a question now, because I can't really think of anything.
John.
Maybe this follows on from Ega's question to an extent. So I'm trying to understand the
Cenosis.
Cenosis?
Yeah.
Okay. I get the virtues about, in terms of thinking about culture, in terms of thinking about legalities, but I'm puzzled as to what the virtues of that would be for thinking about crisis. So if the privileged structure of time is a time of crisis, and that's characterized by a kind of temporal funnel, it's characterized by degrees of irreversibility. There's a critical threshold beyond which previous conditions can't be revisited. I wondered how you would think about that in relation to chronocenosis.
Do you have a particular crisis in mind? I feel like because I feel like I feel like it could practically. I don't have an abstract way of saying if you don't got crisis, this is what you do. But I think but if you were to give me a crisis, I could maybe come up with something. But I feel like it works differently depending on what you. Sorry, it's me. I think thinking about climate change, the stakes there are very different from whether we're thinking about the genocide in Palestine, right? But I think that it can be. I mean, what do shapes help us when a crisis is there? These crises will not be solved by thinking through certain shapes, right? That's in a way I always get a little bit depressed when we're doing this, we're making art, we're thinking through these things, but what are we actually doing? So there is that. But I think I guess climate change, for example, requires us to make a legal contract with future generations. Depending on where you are, this contract will look very different depending on the colonial legacy of the place that you're in, or histories of fascism within the country, and how you tackle this. So that doesn't help, does it? Yes.
So I hardly answered John, but a follow-up question to you. So I think that notion of, sorry, I'm just going to talk this way. So I think that notion of crisis as a funnel point presumes linear time. So once you go through it, you can't go back, because there are no other routes in the line. But the current notion of polycrisis, which Adam is suggests there are many crises happening simultaneously, and you can't address them one by one. So they kind of more multiply, divide each other. I think that seems closer to chronocenotic description, because like the climate change crisis has its own many temporalities as well. So sea change is a different temporality. Pollution is related to a different temporality to any other bit of the climate crisis we talk about. But all those crises are attached to nationalisms, which have their own related but distinct temporality. But they're all kind of stacked on top of each other.
Yeah.
And you can't pull one out
No.
without affecting all the others.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's quasi-independent of each other. Right? So the nationalism thing, it's a crisis from, say, 17, something like the period you're talking about, from 16-something to now.
Like Westphalian peace onwards.
Yes, kind of that model. The timescale for resolving that would be maybe 150 years.
Yeah.
Climate breakdown is like tens of thousands of years.
Yeah.
But we're
Exactly.
facing all of them simultaneously.
Yeah.
So that kind of time stack,
Yeah.
or the multiplicity of different times and histories and agencies as well.
Yeah.
Presumably it's the kind of chronocenosis.
Yeah, I think for the polycrisis, it's. I mean, the polycrisis is a good model to understand the polycrisis, but I think it's. I mean, I think what because it comes from a legal backdrop. I think there is something about. The one thing is to understand how different crises, the temporalities of different crises, how they interact. I guess the thing that, like thinking about it in terms of legality, is that regardless of whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, at some point, legality says that at some point a decision is made, certain counterfactuals are excluded, certain temporalities are synchronized. And I guess like that dimension of decision making, is it sometimes reminds me a little bit of the David Graeber line of, like when you look back in history, you realize that people just made some decisions and that they were never written into, like they were never like cut into stone. So we can make, decisions can be made. This makes this whole thing sound like self-therapy, but I'm cool with that.
We've got a few questions.
Hi.
Hi.
So I noticed three things that I think might be tied together. It was like you talking about this ideological kind of eagerness from your side to write about things. Also this aesthetical call for art to be made from chronocenosis, and also your out of art not being just political stance, right? And I was, because we talked about this in the research groups a bit, if there's like this sort of epistemological abandonment, I'm quite curious about what is like the propositional way of like letting your curiosity jump between things and proposing things. And I think this pedagogical way you were talking about, like just even the prompt of let's cross a bunch of modalities and see what comes out of that. Just how that translates in your practice as well. If that has to do with like the tones of what is judicial, what is sovereignty, what is historical. If that's something you cross through just your curiosity, there's like a political motivation behind that, or an aesthetical motivation behind that. Quite curious to know.
Thank you, Pedro. I would, if you don't mind me saying, like, Pedro, I think you at some point, I think it was during the first research group, I think you said something along the lines of, does chronocenosis just encourage you to acknowledge that there are forms of knowledge within a chronocenotic framework that you just don't know, but you still have to acknowledge them? I think that was you. I think like I was.
Yeah.
I think that was also a nice. It really stayed with me because I think, like, I'm not a religious theorist. I have to acknowledge the fact that in some contexts it makes a big difference. I'm not a specialist in I don't like cars, but I understand that in America, because everything is so fucking far away, you have to have it. So these are not forms of knowledge that are not my own, but these are forms of temporality that one has to acknowledge. I just wanted to say that was. Thank you for that context, Pedro. Everyone. To the multimodal, the chronocenotic thinking and practice. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and also like I think I'd be quite curious to know if like there's an aesthetic motivation.
Oh, about motivation, political motivation.
Because when you talked about the ideological, I thought of how in rhetoric things have been kind of abandoned throughout history that can constitute part of the rhetoric. Like even for fear of reification, if you just like try and have an impetus towards beauty or allegorizing everything that goes on politically, then you run that risk of like reifying something that's going on. That's a real event that maybe is urgent for the people. So like we tend to drop things out of the discourse that have that sort of aesthetical drive. And I just wanted to know if that's like coming back in a little bit.
I thought I had your question and I could answer it the first time you asked it, and now I don't know anymore. The aesthetic drive. What's the political drive? What's the aesthetic drive? I don't know. Can I have a drink and then tell you honestly? Sorry, I just can't.
I have kind of a short question, which is something to do with probably the way the digital twin. What happens to the sort of chronocenotic thinking, like the sort of, as I understood that, a sort of concurrent evolution, temporal, multiple times body crisis, kind of multitudinousness of time. What happens? I know you're not one to kind of be hot on speculation, but what happens years to come with the model of chronocenosis when the digital twin has been established to the extent that we expect it to be established?
Well, there's because of the polar crisis, there's always a question of whether everything's going to go to shit before anyone can make a fine model. But let's assume that all of the resources are going to go into the digital twins and none of the resources are going to go into anything else. In that context, I guess like the way that consultancies work is that you'll have shareholders, and the shareholders, if a company, or God forbid, a kind of actually political agency makes a decision, the shareholders have to give their go-ahead. And at the moment, you put consultants in the middle, and the consultants say, it's a good idea, we looked at all of the information. And then the shareholders say, okay, cool, let's put some money into it. And I guess like, the constant corrosion of any agency within the public political sphere, I would be worried what happens if these models become the go-to, like you haven't consulted the model, how can you make these decisions? And it just gives politicians who are already being small beans and saying like, oh my God, it's ultra complicated, I couldn't possibly make a decision, even though that's exactly their job, that this decision can then be deferred to yet another entity that eats up a shit ton of water and also works in a way that is entirely oblique. So yeah, I think like the insurance industry is probably going to have a lot of fun with digital twins, and we know what racial and gender and all sorts of other biases there already are in large language models. We can only assume what happens if you put a ton of other data in there and then you square it. Who's going to suffer from that? I don't think it's really. Then again, there might come a time when the NVIDIA digital twin will say, well, in order to solve this dam problem, we need to renationalize the water infrastructure and do all of these good things. And maybe there will be a politician who will say, actually, let's do that. Maybe there is also the positive round of that where actually we'll start to believe what good models say, if they are good models. Sorry.
Shall we take a few more? Have we got enough time? A couple more? Maybe one more? Okay.
Thank you, Klara.
Top.
Sorry.
I hear you.
Yeah, but they can't. That's okay. So, opera, right?
Yeah.
So I I think partly, just to follow up from the last question, the digital twin is a piece of infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
It's a way for people to kind of assess your life and your what's it called, the insurance stuff without actually having to ask you questions.
Mm-hmm.
And you're also aggregated as a statistical probability amongst what everyone else is doing, which is category and so on. But it's a way of kind of capturing a whole bunch of stuff from a certain vantage point. It seems to me like, the stuff around infrastructure, like it was really fast. That was something kind of
Yeah, sorry.
I don't know all of it. No, it's fine. It's like you have a lot to do. But I'm just trying to maybe rehearse some of that game now. But the thing about infrastructure is it's also for all of the, and kind of very much like the emphasis on infrastructure isn't just the hardware, it's all the stuff that happens around the hardware. And the kind of communities that get built, and sort of the conversations that happen, and how things get translated, and so on and so forth. So there's a narrative cultural stream alongside the material stream of infrastructure. But it does act as a kind of filter and a kind of slice across these kind of multi-temporalities. Also infrastructure that's built on top of each other.
Yeah.
So like the internet we have since 2000 is going to phase out and be technically insufficient in the next 5 years. And really whole new hardware is going to be built on the old one. I think that's the one of the current problems. But I was wondering about the vantage point from which you see chronocenosis. Right? So, like, just go back to the opera thing, which I think is also another type of inherited infrastructure. And I know almost nothing about opera theory, but one thing I do know is the idea of the total artwork, the Gesamtkunstwerk, which is from Wagner, bad guy, because of Nazis and stuff. So, but Wagner's idea was that you have lots and lots of like early modern to modern types of art forms, and they're all separated from each other because it's the time of paintings, not sculptures, isn't it? So it's pre-contemporary art. But actually, opera can bring them all together, right? So you can have everything in one art form, and that art form is an equivalent to the totality of the world. Something like that. Now we have contemporary art. We don't care about things in that way. So contemporary art is doing opera. So the opera position, insofar as it kind of gathers all the different moments, and so it acts as a kind of picture of chronocenosis. Where is that in? Because it's kind of outside, because it's looking on, but it's also at the same time, it doesn't seem like you can get outside of chronocenosis, right? Because it's just like all time is stacked on top of all historical structures are stacked in and amongst other historical structures.
So I think you mentioned contemporary art, and I guess like there's, if we know it's a simplistic history of contemporary art in the 20s.
That's what we do here.
That's what I hear, But if someone wanted to say like if contemporary art was the propaganda machine of the kind of the liberal state of the 20th century, that is a slightly simplistic, but bear with, then opera is the equivalent for the 19th century nation state, and you get these like strange stories of like all of these like abandoned opera houses in like Vietnam and in Iran. Their opera house, they just build them as like these like little like what museums used to be, and so I think of this both as I think like it's the only art form. The two other like, this is just like things I think about opera, and I will get back to your question. It's the only art form that has never broken even because it's so stupidly expensive. So it's always, like whenever you're closest to the money, someone is going to make an opera. Like it's just the thing. You kind of have to, like, rich people have to do it. And then I think in the back of my head, I have like a very cozy voice, the cozy voice of Georges Bataille, who talks about, who like in The Accursed Share has this like an economic theory of abundance rather than lack, and says like every culture produces abundance, and it's luxury, war, or what's the other one? Bataille, help me out. that's not. It also features, but then it's like I think it's art. No, it's art, luxury, and war, and yeah. I sometimes think of like opera as this like weird abundance machine because it costs so much. It's so shit. The institutions that run it are horrible. They're all racist, and I don't know. But it's this like big maximalist thing. So I think like there is just I'm eternally excited by the sheer absurdism of the form, and then I think so like the kind of the Wagner model. I mean, the Wagner model was very much like it is the Wagner model, and it's sadly the one that then lasted throughout. But you know, like 18th century opera, no one rehearsed anything. There are these letters that Mozart wrote to his dad, and he was like, "My God, we rehearsed the Magic Flute." It was incredible, and the idea that you would have like 100 people dancing, 15 soloists, a chorus, and then this like insane 18th century stage technology where you'd have like ship coming from like there and like some clouds and then like lights and everything, and then no one rehearsed anything, so everyone just vibed it, and then like 3 hours later you've got this like complete chaos. And meanwhile, people like the audience is not sitting in the dark; they're all eating. And there is like I think like there's I don't know, when I think of these operas, like there's I think my interior desire for chaos enjoys that. But then I guess having been a producer of opera, I guess it's the chronocenosis becomes evident because I think I guess like if. I wonder if I were to say to someone at the Royal Opera House, like, you get what I'm saying? I feel like they would know because they're like huge machines, these opera houses, and they're complex and horrifically badly designed. But yeah, it becomes an interesting. That was the most blithe thing I could have said in response to your question, but make of that what you will. Sorry.
One last question. One last question. Oh, yeah.
Just trying a little bit back to the question that didn't land earlier about the political and aesthetic motivation. One of the other things about that is switch the lights off. Right, so Wagner configures the kind of audience to stage relationship, you know, which is kind of attention-driven, it's focal, it's committed, you know what I mean? All of the kind of civilizing rituals which we then associate with kind of particular forms of museum practice also. And I wonder about, in a way, this question of like a production model, you know, chronocenosis as something that allows you to inhabit a particular production space in a mode that is attentive to chronocenosis. In a way.
That question.
And in a way, back to the kind of aesthetic, then what happens, how does an audience feature in that? And it sounds like a really dumb question, but it's about the kind of, in a way, this question of distribution again. You know, is it producing a model, which I think is entirely plausible, or does it offer some other form of engagement in these kind of multiplicities? Either answer is good. You know, it's just like it's an aesthetic dispositif, isn't it?
I guess, like, you know, it's like I think there's a reason to think about operas because they get this, like, the biggest share of the Arts Council budget. There's also a good reason to not think about opera because it's just so it's just so stupid. Like, you know, like the problems that they have are so stupid. Almost like, I guess, like, you know, opera did not undergo any kind of assessment of its own infrastructure. It has just never happened. It still does, like, you know, like in this country, it still regurgitates this, like, 19th century. I mean, like, even Katie Mitchell, like the biggest female opera director who's now left because it's too racist, it's too misogynistic for her, was told that she wasn't allowed to use modern costumes on stage. It had to be 19th century. You know, like, it's stupid. So I guess, like, you know, like what would happen if you produce a different model? I don't know. I guess, like, one thing you could do is to now I'm going to sound like a solid liberal and say, like, cut short the communication barriers, because the way that I understand it, well, it certainly works on the continent, is that the director thinks something and then it takes about 2 weeks to get to a workshop. And the last time I worked on a big opera, which was like a 2 million kind of baby thing, they produced this weird situation where, like, someone pushed in a bathtub full of bloody clay because 2 weeks earlier someone had made it. They waste a shit ton of money in these kind of conditions. But I don't know if it would be worth doing a kind of, no, it feels kind of very modernist. Let's look at the, kind of like André Bazin in cinema. It's like, let's look at the machinery behind it. I don't know how, like, I mean, it's, you know, we all have to spend our time somehow before we die, so you could do it.
I think, I don't know, should we come draw this to an end? I was just thinking about totalizing forms, and opera seems a totalizing form for now. In some ways, it seems a form for this polycrisis.
I think this is maybe like, I mean, in a kind of perverse way, maybe this is more like the 18th century model of opera, where like everyone is just doing terrible things at the same time, nothing's coming together. I don't know.
I think we're overrunning slightly, are we? I think so. I'm never quite sure when to end. I could go on for another half an hour, but it feels like we should stop. And really just say a huge thank you to Klara. Thank you very much.